Archaeologists have uncovered something chilling beneath Egypt's temples, hidden rooms with no light, no sound, and no easy way out. These weren't just storage spaces. They were built for one purpose: to punish. Priests used them to isolate, intimidate, and, according to research, purify those who dared defy the gods. Confinement wasn't simply about pain, it was framed as a way to cleanse the soul. Inside, people sat in utter darkness, surrounded by walls covered in hieroglyphic threats from gods like Sekhmet and Anubis, reminders that punishment here was both physical and spiritual. Above ground, things looked very different. Tourists today stroll through Karnak temple's open courtyards, snapping photos of giant statues and columns. But below those stones, priests once guided people into rooms cut off from light and sound. These temples weren't just impressive landmarks, they doubled as spiritual courts, and the punishment areas were hidden far from public view. At Dendera Temple, archaeologists uncovered a staircase that led to a chamber so tight you had to turn sideways just to squeeze in. The walls weren't just decorated, they were inscribed with warnings like, "Anubis judges the wicked." These messages weren't meant for the gods, they were meant for anyone unlucky enough to end up inside. Priests controlled access to these rooms with the seriousness of a security detail, except instead of showing you out, they locked you in. Edfu Temple's basement took things further. Its thick mud brick walls trapped sound so well that modern engineers found nearly no noise escaped. If someone shouted for help, you could be standing close by and hear nothing. The silence was part of the punishment. Total isolation with no hope that anyone would hear you. Why go to such lengths? Because fear could do what fines or beatings couldn't. There's a papyrus from Edfu that tells the story of a baker who stole sacred bread. His punishment wasn't public humiliation or a beating. Instead, he was left in the belly of the temple until his heart confessed. No trial, no debate, just darkness and the constant reminder that the gods were watching. The psychological tactics were relentless. Karnak's underground cells had ceilings so low you couldn't stand up straight. At Dendera, the only air vent was placed so guards could listen through it, giving prisoners no sense of connection to the outside world. Offenders were sometimes blindfolded and led through winding corridors before being locked away, so even if they wanted to escape, they wouldn't know which way to run. Access to these spaces was tightly controlled. At Medinet Habu, only 2 priests had keys to the purification rooms. Everything about the process was designed to disorient and intimidate. Some punishments were disguised as healing too. At Kam Ambo's healing temple, people with illnesses were sometimes confined in these hidden rooms as a kind of spiritual treatment. Though archaeological evidence at Abydos shows that some skeletons found in sealed chambers had signs of malnutrition and healed fractures, hinting at long-term confinement. And none of this was against the rules. Temple law called it divine justice. There was no limit to how long you could be left in the dark. At Abydos, archaeologists found a cell with scratch marks, 1,742 lines etched into the wall, one for each day a prisoner kept track before they gave up. These weren't dungeons filled with torture devices. They were empty rooms, suffocating silence, and the growing fear that you'd been erased from the world above. And it wasn't just the darkness or the loneliness, it was the architecture itself that did the work. If you've ever felt uneasy in a cramped hallway, you've already had a taste of what the ancient Egyptians engineered on purpose. Temple architects made certain corridors so narrow that anyone entering had to crouch or crawl, as shown by soot marks low on the walls and ground-penetrating radar mapping. There was no chance of walking through these spaces with your dignity or your nerves intact. But the walls weren't just close. They were covered with carvings of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of vengeance, glaring down with warnings like, "The devourer waits for the unclean." At Luxor Temple, those hieroglyphs didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat. Abydos took things further. One passage forces you to bend double under a carving of Anubis holding a noose, and the ceiling keeps dropping until you're practically crawling. These weren't design quirks. Across multiple sites, architects followed precise plans to make these spaces as unwelcoming as possible. The effect? Disorientation and fear. Archaeologists and confinement experts agree that sensory deprivation in tight, dark spaces is a recipe for panic, even for people who aren't usually claustrophobic. Add in gods threatening eternal punishment, and you've got a psychological trap that works overtime. Some temples played even dirtier tricks. At Dendera, researchers mapped a tunnel that loops around in circles before finally reaching the confinement chamber. Prisoners would think they'd walked for miles, when in reality, they'd barely left the entrance. The floor sloped just enough to make your legs ache, but not enough to notice what was happening until you were already exhausted. Airflow was another tool in the priest's arsenal. Ambo's so-called purification corridor has vents placed to create sudden, unpredictable drafts. One moment you're sweating in stagnant heat, the next you're hit with a cold gust. Medical scrolls from the time call this the breath of the gods. But let's be honest, it was just the priests messing with your senses. Sound played a part too. Philae Temple's underground system has walls that bounce whispers from one corridor to another. You'd catch fragments of chanting or cries, never knowing if they were real or just echoes. Modern audio tests show it's like being stuck in a haunted house with voices drifting in and out at random. Even the doors were designed to mess with you. Some had false lintels, extra stone blocks above the entrance so it looked shorter than it was. You duck automatically, putting yourself in a submissive pose before you even realized it. At Medinet Habu, the doorways taper inward, creating an illusion that the exit keeps shrinking the deeper you go. Lighting, or the lack of it, was deliberate. Torch holders were spaced so far apart that the next flicker of light always seemed just out of reach. Some corridors had copper strips angled to make shadows move in your peripheral vision, so you'd always feel like something or someone was right behind you. Recent scans at Abasir turned up something even creepier, a confinement room where your own heartbeat echoes off the walls, and another at Esna, where every swallow or blink seems amplified. It's like the priests installed ancient surround sound just to remind you how alone you were. All of this wasn't just random cruelty. It was about establishing control, breaking down a person's sense of space, time, and self. By the time someone was released, if they were lucky enough to get out, the priests had already made their point. And that brings us to the real power behind these temples, the priesthood and their grip on justice. The priests in ancient Egypt didn't just run ceremonies, they ran the justice system. Their word was law, and their courts operated with a level of authority that would make most modern judges look like referees at a kid's soccer game. If you were accused of blasphemy or theft, you didn't get a slap on the wrist. You got a sentence straight from the gods. At least, that's how the priests framed it. Punishments ranged from public lashings to nights spent in pitch-black cells where you'd have plenty of time to think about your choices. At Karnak Temple, priests kept meticulous trial records on papyrus. One scroll describes a farmer caught sneaking grain from temple stores. His punishment, 50 lashes in front of the statue of Amun, then 3 days in a cell with nothing but darkness and the company of whatever insects crawled in with him. There's another case of a scribe who made a mistake copying sacred texts. Instead of a second chance, he got his writing hand branded with a hot iron in the shape of Thoth's feather, so everyone would know exactly what he'd done. Public humiliation was a favorite tool. The most famous example comes from Deir el-Medina, where a laborer caught stealing had his head shaved and was forced to wear donkey ears made of papyrus. He stood outside the temple gates for a week, while passersby pelted him with rotten fruit. Other punishments were just as creative. Some offenders had to parade through the streets in ridiculous costumes or were forced to sweep temple courtyards while everyone watched. The idea was to make sure nobody forgot your crime. Food was another weapon. At Dendera, prisoners got only stale bread and brackish water, while the priests dined on roasted meats and fresh fruit within sight of the cells. One scroll even brags about a thief who confessed just to get a bite of real food. Branding left a permanent mark. Archaeologists have excavated numerous bronze tools shaped like hieroglyphs. Thief, liar, and others used to burn symbols onto the arms or faces of offenders. These brands couldn't be hidden, and in a society obsessed with status, they followed you everywhere. The priests also controlled access to the temple, which meant they could banish you from religious life. At Ambo, a stone stela lists people forbidden from entering temple grounds. No temple, no offerings, no afterlife insurance. That was a punishment worse than jail for many. Banishment was another favorite. Priests could declare someone unclean and force them to live outside city walls, cut off from family and neighbors. Temple records show that this kind of exile could last for years, and once you were out, there was little hope of coming back. What really stands out is how routine all of this was. The priests had forms for verdicts, checkboxes for crimes, and scribes tallying up lashings like they were keeping score. And while regular people faced harsh justice, the priests themselves seemed to operate above the law. There's a case where a priest smashed a sacred statue while drunk, and his fellow priests just wrote it off as the will of the gods. Meanwhile, a laborer who dropped a brick in the same area lost his hand. This system worked for centuries because it didn't just punish the body, it targeted the mind. The threat of being locked away, marked for life, or cut off from the gods was enough to keep most people in line. And for those who ended up in the priest's darkest cells, the real torment was only beginning. What actually happened to people locked away in total darkness? Modern solitary confinement is harsh, but ancient Egyptian priests had their own version, and it was just as effective at breaking people down. At Karnak Temple, archaeological reports refer to darkened wall surfaces that absorbed light, creating a kind of black void where not even a flicker got through. These weren't just dim rooms. They were places where prisoners lost all sense of time, unsure if they'd been there for hours or weeks. Everything about these chambers was designed to mess with your senses. At Edfu, temple records describe sealed doors that muffled all sound, forcing prisoners to scream just to feel anything, a tactic confirmed by the silence in comparable sites. There are stories of people scratching themselves raw just to prove they were still alive. The mental effects were brutal. There's an account from Deir el-Medina about a prisoner who, after days in the dark, started talking to people who weren't there. He begged guards to stop the stone people from whispering. Another record mentions a man who forgot his own name after a week locked away. Some chambers made things worse on purpose. At Abydos, one cell had a fake ceiling with hidden holes so priests could drop scorpions or snakes inside without being seen. The logs bragged about how quickly this method got people to confess. Even time itself became a weapon. At Philae, isolation rooms had water clocks that dripped at random intervals. Prisoners tried to count the drips, hoping to track the days, but the rhythm would always change. Some came out convinced they'd been underground for months when it had only been a few days. Archaeologists found graffiti, year 3, next to a prisoner's name, but carbon dating showed he'd only been there 9 days. These punishments weren't short, either. Some records mention isolation lasting until the moon changes, about a month. Repeat offenders got even longer. At Medinet Habu, a skeleton found curled up in a cell showed no signs of violence, just muscle wasting from being stuck in darkness for too long. The priests claimed all this was for spiritual cleansing. Darkness, they said, would help you see your sins. But the real result was predictable. With punishments like these, it gets hard to tell where ritual ends and torture begins. The lines blur, especially when you look at the so-called purification ceremonies that followed. Ritual or torture. In ancient Egypt, the two often looked exactly the same. Take the so-called purification practices. On the surface, they were all about spiritual rebirth and pleasing the gods. But if you were on the receiving end, it felt a lot more like punishment than prayer. Let's start with the cleansing of the mouth at Karnak Temple. Temple walls are covered with texts describing offenders forced to kneel and recite long lists of confessions, 42 to be exact. These weren't gentle admissions either. Priests stood over you, demanding you repeat every line perfectly, sometimes for hours. The official story? You were opening the way for Ma'at's truth. But nobody was fooled. After a few rounds, most people would say whatever the priests wanted just to make it stop. At Dendera, purification took a different turn. There was the scale test, where the accused would lie beneath a giant ritual balance. Archaeologists have found these balances in the temple complex, and local tradition holds they symbolize the weighing of sins. The ritual involved priests piling symbolic weights on the other side, with the idea that your soul would be balanced only after you'd endured enough discomfort. Water rituals didn't offer much relief. At Edfu Temple, there was the Well of Truth. Accused criminals were lowered into a well by basket and dunked repeatedly. The water wasn't deep, but the repeated plunging left people gasping and terrified. Priests claimed the innocent would float while the guilty would sink. Of course, after enough dunkings, everyone sank. Old temple records brag about confessions wrung out after only a few rounds, even when the evidence pointed elsewhere. Fire rituals had their own brand of misery. At Kamambo, priests led offenders barefoot across heated stones as part of Sekhmet's path. Recent scans have revealed scorch marks on the stone floors, suggesting these ceremonies were more than just symbolic. The wounds were explained as signs of purification, but anyone who's ever burned their foot knows it's not exactly a spiritual experience. Sleep and food deprivation were also part of the process. The vigil of Anubis at Abydos forced prisoners to stay awake for days while priests chanted and rattled instruments nearby. Graffiti in the cells tells the real story. One prisoner scratched, "The jackals never stop howling," over and over into the wall. Food restrictions were just as harsh. The fast of Osiris meant eating nothing but salted bread for weeks, with no water allowed. Temple doctors wrote about visions of the gods, but modern science calls that dehydration and delirium. Even sound was weaponized. At Philae Temple, priests played harmonicas or pipes at certain frequencies during sound purification. One cell wall is covered in scratched hieroglyphs begging for the music to stop. Archaeologists found instruments tuned to frequencies known to cause headaches and confusion. The real trick was in the branding. Priests gave everything a sacred name. Branding became sealing with divine fire. Solitary confinement was the womb of rebirth, and flogging was striking the evil from the body. To the outside world, it was all part of the path to purity. But for those inside, it was a system designed to break the spirit as much as the body. Some didn't survive it. Others emerged changed, convinced their suffering was a gift from the gods. But for a few, there was something worse than pain or confession, being left behind with no one to remember their names. At Medinet Habu, archaeologists opened a sealed room and found multiple skeletons curled against the walls, as if they'd simply lain down and never gotten up. No signs of violence, no grave offerings, just bones, dust, and silence. These weren't the honored dead with golden masks or painted coffins. These were people who vanished from history, forgotten on purpose. In ancient Egypt, being erased was the worst fate. If you died a criminal, your family could still mourn. If you died a nobody, you slipped out of memory. Priests at Karnak kept detailed records of punishments, but when it came to deaths from confinement, the entry was just a quick note. Return to the gods. No name, no story. Archaeologists have found dozens of these unofficial burials under temple floors. No proper markers, just the leftovers of lives that didn't matter to the people in charge. The priests didn't just punish the body, they made sure you knew you were joining a long line of people who would never be remembered. Temple bureaucracy helped. Ritual tools and livestock got detailed logs, but if someone died in confinement, the entry was vague. The matter concluded. At Philae, a papyrus notes a prisoner transferred to the god's custody, and archaeologists later found a skeleton bricked up in a storage room. This wasn't sloppy record-keeping, it was a system designed to erase. Sometimes the only clues left behind are heartbreakingly personal. At Karnak, someone scratched "Remember Me" into a cell wall and drew an eye beneath it, hoping for a witness. At Edfu, a prisoner carved a tiny self-portrait next to the words, "I existed." These weren't hardened criminals. Most were petty thieves or people who angered the wrong priest. Their biggest crime? Being inconvenient. Egyptians built pyramids to last forever, but for the forgotten, it was the opposite. No monuments, no prayers, just a quiet place where the world moved on above and your name faded with the dust. What the priests tried to hide, though, is finally coming to light. How do new technologies rewrite what we thought we knew about divine justice? Modern archaeologists are turning up evidence that would have shocked the priests who built these temples. Recent tech has revealed secrets hidden for thousands of years, and the details aren't pretty. At Dendera Temple, ground-penetrating radar exposed a network of narrow tunnels beneath the sanctuary. The walls are covered in soot, but only up to about 4 feet high. That's not what you'd expect from normal temple maintenance. Researchers now believe prisoners were forced to crawl through these passages, spending long hours on hands and knees. The lead Egyptologist said, "The soot patterns tell us these weren't just for repairs. People lived down there, and not by choice." Karnak has its own set of surprises. In 2020, a team found a sealed chamber with deep scratch marks covering the lower part of every wall. Forensic work showed the marks were made by human fingernails over long periods, not just a few desperate minutes. They also found rusted ankle shackles, still bolted to the floor, with bone fragments left inside. Then there's Abydos. In 2021, archaeologists used CT scans to look inside what everyone thought was a solid wall. Instead, they found hollow chambers packed with skeletons curled up in fetal positions. Many of the bones showed signs of malnutrition and old, healed fractures. One burial even had a clay tablet that read, "I was innocent," scratched out in shaky hieroglyphs. The lead archaeologist said, "We're not just looking at punishment. This is systematic abuse." Each new discovery chips away at the old story of purification chambers. These weren't places to cleanse the soul. They were sites of calculated, organized confinement. The priests weren't just spiritual guides. They were judges and jailers, running a system designed to control through fear, pain, and isolation. And if you think the physical evidence is bad, just wait until you hear what they did to people's minds. Psychological warfare was the priest's specialty, and they didn't need whips or chains to make it work. The real punishment happened in the mind, long before anyone laid a hand on you. Ancient Egyptian temples were set up to make you question what was real, what was sacred, and what was just in your head. Start with the visuals. Deity carvings were positioned to catch flickering torchlight, creating a sense that gods themselves watched each step. At Luxor and Karnak, statues and painted eyes seemed to follow you through the corridors. The hieroglyphs underneath didn't just warn you, they spoke in the voice of the gods. "My flames consume liars' tongues," or "I see the truth in your heart." After hours of crawling past these messages, even the most stubborn prisoner started to believe they were being judged from every angle. Modern psychologists call this visual priming. The brain fills in the blanks, and soon you're seeing threats everywhere, even in the shadows. All of this worked so well that even centuries later, people were still afraid of what went on in those rooms. The legacy of this psychological warfare didn't fade away. It was something later generations tried very hard to forget. The priests didn't just abandon these punishment chambers, they tried to wipe them off the map. At Karnak, workers filled underground corridors with rubble and sealed doorways with bricks that matched the rest of the temple. It wasn't a sloppy job, they wanted these places to disappear. Archaeologists have found sealed passages where the only clue is a slightly different mortar line or a hidden hinge. These weren't accidents, they were cover-ups. At Dendera, later generations clearly knew something was off. Visitors avoided certain sealed passages, and warnings scratched into nearby stones hint at a reputation for danger that lingered long after the priests were gone. Roman builders adding to the temple changed their plans to avoid blocked tunnels. Even people who worshiped different gods wanted nothing to do with these rooms. Temples got creative with their makeovers. Edfu turned a confinement block into a linen storage area, painting over the walls to hide the past. But scrape away the whitewash and you'll still find prisoner scratches underneath. At Kamambo, priests started calling old punishment cells healing chambers, but left the heavy doors and locks in place. Nothing says therapy like a room you can't leave. Sometimes the attempts to hide these places actually made them easier to find. At Philae, priests walled up an entire punishment wing, but used bricks stamped with the pharaoh's name and "Purifier of the Land." Modern archaeologists just followed the trail of stamped bricks straight to the sealed chambers. Not exactly subtle. It wasn't just Egyptians who kept their distance. Multiple cultures that came after, Greeks, Romans, and later locals, avoided these corridors. The fear stuck around, even as the temples changed hands and religions. Even when archaeologists rediscovered these rooms, the truth stayed buried. Early 20th century dig reports dismissed obvious confinement cells as storage areas or dressing rooms, even when the evidence, like shackles still attached to benches, was right there. The most telling sign is what's missing. Temple archives detail every ritual object, but barely mention these rooms. The few references you get are vague, like special purification or the sealed remedy. Modern technology is forcing the story out. LiDAR scans at Abusir have mapped out entire underground complexes that don't appear on any temple plans. The chambers line up perfectly with the rest of the temple, but someone made sure they weren't on the blueprints. Here's the twist. All those cover-ups actually preserved the evidence. Sealed rooms protected carvings, paint, even scratch marks, so we can see exactly what happened centuries later. The effort to erase this history ended up saving it for us. When you look at how far the priests went to hide their darkest secrets, you have to wonder what it really meant to be punished in ancient Egypt. For some, the worst fate wasn't pain or even death. It was being locked away, erased, and left for no one to remember. Justice in ancient Egypt had a sharp edge. hidden behind temple walls and sacred rituals. While life went on above, those who crossed the line vanished below, swallowed by a system that knew how to break people without leaving a mark. These stories remind us that power, dressed up in religion or tradition, can hide cruelty in plain sight. What else might still lie forgotten beneath ancient stones? If these lost chambers give you chills, hit subscribe and join us as we uncover more secrets buried in the past. The next revelation might change the way you see history and those who write it.